The blizzard had already erased the road when a retired SWAT officer stopped his truck. His K9 didn't bark, didn't move. He just stared into the white silence, at a woman who shouldn't have survived the night. Turning back meant reopening a past he buried in the mountains. Driving on meant letting winter decide her fate. One choice, one moment, 3 lives changed forever. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived early in the high mountains of Colorado, the kind of winter that did not announce itself with beauty, but with pressure, silence, and the promise of isolation. Snow lay heavy on the pine branches surrounding Frank Miller's cabin, bending them low like old men burdened by years they could no longer carry. The sky was a dull, iron gray, and the wind moved through the trees with a low, restless moan, as if the mountains themselves were unsettled. Frank stood on the narrow porch of his weathered log house, one gloved hand wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, watching the horizon disappear behind falling snow. At 64, Frank Miller had the posture of a man who once carried authority without effort. He was tall, just over 6 feet, but age and old injuries had taken some of the height from his spine. His shoulders remained broad, squared by decades of body armor and habit, though now they carried a permanent tension, as if he were still bracing for impact. His face was angular and deeply lined, with a sharp jaw partially hidden beneath a salt and pepper beard, kept trimmed more out of routine than vanity. A thin scar cut across his left eyebrow, pale against weathered skin darkened by years of sun, wind, and exposure. Frank's eyes were what unsettled people the most, steel blue, alert, and distant. They were the eyes of a man who had learned too much about human behavior to find comfort in it. Once, those eyes had scanned hallways and rooftops, door frames and corners, searching for threats. Now, they searched the tree line out of habit, even though no one had visited his property in weeks. He wore an old canvas jacket faded to a muted brown, the fabric stiff from years of use, layered over a thick wool sweater. His jeans were worn thin at the knees, and his boots were heavy, insulated, and practical, boots chosen by a man who valued survival over appearance. Everything Frank owned served a purpose. Nothing was decorative, nothing invited conversation. Behind him, inside the cabin, Duke stirred. The German shepherd rose slowly from his place near the wood stove, joints stiff but dignified. Duke was nearly 10 years old, large even by shepherd standards, with a thick black and tan coat now threaded with gray around his muzzle and chest. His ears no longer stood perfectly upright, one tipped slightly to the side, a souvenir from his years as a K9 partner. His movements were measured, deliberate, and quiet, shaped by training that had never truly left him. Duke's dark eyes followed Frank with unwavering focus. He had been trained to read body language, tone, breath. He knew when Frank was restless, when the man was slipping back into memories neither of them could escape. The dog padded across the wooden floor, nails clicking softly, and stopped just behind Frank at the threshold of the porch. "You don't feel it yet," Frank murmured without turning around, as if the dog had spoken. "Storm's coming harder." Duke lifted his head and sniffed the air. His nostrils flared, and a low, nearly inaudible sound rumbled in his chest, not a growl, not a bark, but acknowledgement. He felt it too. Pressure changes, ozone, the metallic scent of heavy snow. Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, and set the mug down on the porch railing. He had brewed it strong, the way he always did, the way men did when sleep came in fragments and silence felt louder than noise. He hadn't slept well the night before. He rarely did. Inside the cabin, the walls were lined with rough-hewn shelves holding old paperbacks, manuals, and binders filled with neatly labeled notes. There were books on tactical psychology, wilderness survival, and cold weather first aid, mixed with Western novels and a few volumes on philosophy, Stoics mostly. The furniture was sparse but meticulously maintained. A heavy oak table bore the marks of decades of use. A single framed photograph sat on the mantel above the stone fireplace. It showed Frank 25 years younger, clean-shaven, smiling without effort. His arm was slung around a woman with dark hair pulled into a loose braid, her eyes bright and unafraid. She leaned into him with a confidence that came from trust. Frank never moved the photograph. He never dusted it either. Some things were meant to remain untouched. The life Frank had lived before the mountains felt like someone else's memory now. He had spent 32 years with the police department, the last 14 assigned to a SWAT unit known for precision and restraint. Frank had been a team leader, respected for his calm under pressure, his ability to read a room before it exploded. He had believed in control, in preparation, in doing things the right way, until the night everything went wrong. The operation had been planned for weeks. A warehouse, hostages, bad intelligence. One wrong assumption had turned into chaos in under 30 seconds. Frank still remembered the sound, the concussive crack of gunfire echoing in a concrete corridor, the shouted commands overlapping, the sudden silence where a voice should have been. 2 men hadn't walked out. One of them had been Frank's closest friend. The department cleared him. The report said no single decision caused the outcome. But Frank had replayed it thousands of times, every step, every angle. He carried the weight of survival like a verdict. Within a year, he retired early. Within 2, his marriage collapsed under the quiet distance he could no longer bridge. Within 3, he disappeared into the mountains with a dog no one else wanted to adopt. Duke had been deemed too serious, too reactive, too bonded to a single handler. Frank understood that kind of judgment. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the porch railing and sending a fine spray of snow across Frank's boots. He straightened, muscles tightening instinctively. Duke's ears pricked forward, his body angling slightly, toward the tree line. "Easy," Frank said quietly. "Just weather." Still, he stepped back inside, securing the heavy wooden door with a practiced movement. The storm was building faster than expected. He crossed the room, checking the generator panel, then the emergency radio. The cabin was stocked, prepared. Frank had learned long ago that isolation was only tolerable if it was planned. The radio crackled once, then again. Frank froze. He stared at the device as if it were an intruder. He hated the radio. He hated unexpected contact. It represented intrusion, need, responsibility. All the things he had stepped away from. After a moment, he reached for it. "Miller," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Frank? Thank God." The voice on the other end was female, strained but familiar. "It's Sarah Whitman." Sarah Whitman lived nearly 15 miles down the mountain in a modest ranch house. She was in her late 50s, tall and lean, with a practical build shaped by years of physical work rather than exercise routines. Her hair was a light brown streaked with gray, usually pulled into a low ponytail beneath a knit cap. She had sharp features softened by tired eyes and a kindness that came from having seen too much hardship to judge anyone else's. She was one of the few people who still checked in on Frank, though never uninvited. "Sarah," Frank said, "what's wrong?" "It's the Aspen Ridge cabin," she replied. "I had a woman scheduled to stay there. She was supposed to check in yesterday. No call, no message. This storm's coming down hard, Frank. I can't get up there." Frank closed his eyes briefly. Aspen Ridge was remote, even by mountain standards, narrow access road, no cell service. He knew the cabin well. He'd helped repair the roof years ago. "I was going to call the county," Sarah continued, her voice tight. "But with the weather, response time—" "I'll check it," Frank said, the words leaving his mouth before he could reconsider. There was a pause on the line. "You don't have to," Sarah said quietly. "I know." But he already had the keys in his hand. Duke was standing now, alert and ready, his gaze fixed on Frank's face. "Be careful," Sarah said. Frank ended the call without ceremony and pulled on his heavier coat. Duke moved toward the door, tail low but steady, purpose replacing restlessness. Frank paused for a moment, hand on the latch, feeling the weight of the storm pressing against the cabin walls. He had chosen this life for its silence, its distance, its safety. But the mountains, like the past, never stayed quiet forever. And neither, it seemed, would he. The road to the Aspen Ridge cabin narrowed as Frank's truck climbed higher into the timberline, the tires crunching through fresh snow that deepened with every 100 yards. Wind-driven flakes swept across the windshield in sharp horizontal streaks, forcing him to slow until the engine's steady growl was the only thing keeping the silence at bay. Duke sat rigid in the passenger seat, his large frame pressed forward, ears angled sharply, amber-brown eyes fixed on the blur ahead, every muscle tuned to the landscape as if it were a living threat. Frank knew this road by memory rather than sight. He had driven it in all seasons, sometimes to fix a broken hinge, sometimes just to make sure the place hadn't collapsed under snow and neglect. Aspen Ridge was not meant for winter. It was an A-frame cabin tucked into a shallow bowl of pines, pretty in summer, dangerous in cold. When the shape of the roof finally emerged from the white haze, Frank felt a brief, unwelcome surge of relief. No car tracks, no lights, just a dark structure crouched under snow like an animal trying to disappear. "They're not here," Frank muttered, easing the truck to a stop. He reached for the keys, already preparing to turn around. Duke didn't move. Instead, a low sound rolled up from his chest, not a growl meant to threaten, but a deep, urgent vibration that Frank had heard only a handful of times before. Duke's head snapped toward the cabin. His body leaned hard against the passenger door. "No," Frank said automatically. "You're reading ghosts." Duke answered by barking once, sharp, explosive, wrong for an empty place. Then he began to paw at the door, claws scraping metal, breath fogging the glass. Frank swore under his breath and stepped out into the wind. Snow stung his cheeks instantly, worming its way into his collar. He scanned the ground. The storm had erased most tracks, but not all. Something faint. Drag marks near the porch, half buried and uneven. His jaw tightened. "All right," he said, more to himself than the dog. "Show me." The cabin door was unlocked. Frank pushed it open slowly, shoulder angled, senses shifting into a familiar, unwelcome gear. Cold slammed into him, heavier inside than out, a stagnant chill that smelled faintly of old wood, dust, and something else. Metallic. Human. Duke slipped past him without command, nails clattering on the floor as he moved straight toward the far corner of the main room. That was where she was. The woman sat slumped against the wall, half wrapped in a thin decorative throw that did nothing to keep out the cold. She looked to be in her early 50s, though exhaustion and exposure made it hard to tell. Her build was slender, almost fragile, with narrow shoulders hunched inward as if she were trying to take up less space. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, her complexion washed nearly colorless by the cold. Her hair, once a soft chestnut brown, hung loose and tangled. Around her face, streaked darker where snowmelt had dampened it. Her right leg was bent awkwardly, boot twisted at an angle that made Frank's stomach sink. She was shaking hard enough that her teeth clicked audibly, eyes wide and unfocused until they landed on him. "Please," she whispered, voice raw and hoarse. I didn't think anyone was coming." Frank crouched slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "Name's Frank. You're in trouble." Duke stood between them, not touching her, but close enough that his thick fur brushed her knee. He sniffed the air around her, then looked back at Frank, ears high, expression intent. He did not retreat. "What's your name?" Frank asked. "Laura," she said after a moment. "Laura Bennett." Her eyes were a dull green, sharp beneath the fear, the eyes of someone used to reading rooms and people. That registered even through the shock. "How long have you been here?" Frank asked. "I don't know. A day. Maybe 2. She swallowed. "My ride never came back." "Ride?" Frank pressed. She hesitated, fingers tightening in the fabric around her shoulders. "There was an agreement. It fell apart. He left me." Frank nodded once, filing the answer away without comment. He had heard variations of that story before, enough to know when details were being held back. Duke let out a low whine, the sound vibrating against Laura's leg. She flinched, then slowly reached out, stopping short of touching him. "He won't bite," Frank said. "He's deciding." "That's not comforting," she murmured. But there was a flicker of dry humor there, thin but real. Frank moved closer, examined her leg. Swollen, maybe fractured. She wouldn't walk out of here, not in this weather. The wind slammed against the cabin walls, rattling the windows. Snow hissed through the cracks. "We're leaving," Frank said. Laura stared at him. "I can't. I tried to stand. I fell." "I see that." He paused, weighing options he already knew were narrowing. "My place is 2 miles back, warm, stocked. You won't last here." Her lips parted, protest rising, then dying as another shudder tore through her. She nodded once, defeated. "Okay." Frank lifted her carefully, surprised by how little she weighed. She stiffened, then relaxed when she realized he wasn't going to drop her. Duke paced tight circles around them as Frank carried her out into the storm, his body angled to shield her from the wind. By the time they reached the truck, Frank's shoulders burned and his breath came in sharp clouds. The drive back was slower. Laura drifted in and out of awareness, clutching the coat Frank had thrown over her. Duke watched her constantly, his reflection ghosting across the windshield, as if memorizing her. When Frank's cabin door shut behind them, the sudden quiet felt unreal. He laid Laura on the couch near the fire, stoked the flames, then moved with brisk efficiency. Blankets, water, coffee pressed into shaking hands. "Drink," he said, holding the mug until her fingers closed around it. His hands were rough, scarred, steady. Slow. She obeyed. The warmth crept back into her face in painful waves. Tears welled unexpectedly, sliding down into the wool. She turned her head away, embarrassed. "Don't," Frank said quietly. "Cold does that." Duke settled onto the rug near the hearth, eyes never leaving her. After a long silence, Laura spoke. "You didn't have to do this." Frank leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. The firelight carved hard lines across his face. "I know." The storm howled outside, sealing them in, and Frank knew, with a certainty that settled like weight in his chest, that the quiet he had built his life around had just been broken. Snow buried the world with a patient, suffocating persistence, erasing roads, softening angles, and sealing Frank Miller's cabin into a pocket of white silence that felt less like shelter and more like a holding cell carved by nature. The storm no longer roared, it pressed. Each hour added weight to the roof, to the trees, to the unspoken tension settling between the man, the woman, and the dog. Frank measured time by small rituals, feeding the fire, checking the radio, scanning the windows, habits honed over decades of control. Laura measured it by pain, guilt, and the slow return of sensation to her injured leg, each throb a reminder that she was awake and exposed in a place she did not belong. Laura Bennett changed once the immediate danger of freezing passed. Color crept back into her face, faint but undeniable, revealing skin that had known better climates and careful maintenance. She washed at the sink when Frank was outside, tying her chestnut hair back with a strip torn from an old shirt, revealing a high forehead and a narrow, intelligent face marked by restraint rather than softness. She was not tall, perhaps 5'5", but carried herself with an ingrained composure that did not vanish even when seated. Her hands were long-fingered, nails trimmed short, the hands of someone accustomed to documents, screens, and decisions rather than manual labor. When she spoke, her voice was calm and precise, shaped by years of choosing words carefully, and when she fell silent, it was never empty. It was calculated, protective. Frank noticed all of it, though he pretended not to. He had learned to read inconsistencies the way others read headlines. Laura's vocabulary slipped sometimes, too polished for the story she told. Her questions, when she asked them, circled the edges of safety, access, and timing. She did not panic the way stranded tourists did. She conserved energy. She watched. On the second morning, Frank woke before dawn, the cold already clawing at the edges of the cabin despite the fire he had banked overnight. He moved quietly, pulling on his jacket, stepping outside to clear snow from the generator vent. The sky was a dull, bruised purple, light struggling to exist. Duke followed him, limping slightly on his left hind leg, an old injury that flared in the cold but never slowed his vigilance. The shepherd's coat was thick and clean, his frame still powerful despite the years, and when he stood against the white landscape, he looked like a relic from a harsher, more honest time. When Frank returned inside, he found Laura awake, sitting upright on the couch, blanket pulled around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the door as if memorizing the sound of his footsteps. Duke paused, sniffed the air, then crossed the room and lay down near her feet instead of his usual place by the stove. He did not touch her, but he stayed close, his presence a silent, deliberate decision. "You don't trust easily," Laura said quietly, watching Frank pour coffee. "No," Frank replied, "and neither do you." A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "Fair." The days blurred into a quiet endurance test. Snow fell, stopped, then fell again. The radio crackled with distant updates: roads closed, power lines down, search operations suspended until conditions improved. Frank said little, but Laura listened to everything, her gaze sharpening at certain phrases, dulling at others. She asked no questions about his past, yet she absorbed the way he moved, the scars on his hands, the controlled violence in his stillness. This was not a man who had merely grown old in isolation. This was a man who had chosen it. On the third day, Frank noticed the first sign that something beyond the storm had found them. While checking the perimeter, he saw tracks, faint, deliberate impressions that did not match animal movement or drifting snow. They were too measured, too purposeful. Duke found them too, his body stiffening, ears angling forward, a low, warning rumble vibrating in his chest. When Frank came back inside, his expression had shifted. Laura saw it immediately. "Someone out there?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe not." Her fingers tightened around the mug. She looked away, jaw working as if holding back words that threatened to spill and change everything. That night the cabin felt smaller. The fire popped and hissed, shadows dancing across the walls. Frank sat at the table cleaning a rifle he rarely used, the ritual precise, grounding. Laura watched from the couch, her leg elevated, pain dull but persistent. "They're not my friends," she said suddenly. Frank didn't look up. Didn't think they were. "They won't come openly," she continued, voice steady but low. "They never do. They wait, they pressure, they make people disappear quietly." Frank assembled the rifle with a soft click. "You want to tell me who they are?" Laura closed her eyes for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet. If I say it out loud, it becomes real. And once it's real, it touches you. I don't want that." Frank leaned back, studying her. His face was unreadable, but something old and sharp stirred behind his eyes. "You crossed that line when you came through my door." She met his gaze. "I know." Duke rose then, moving between them, placing his body closer to Laura than Frank had ever seen. He leaned his weight slightly against her injured leg, not enough to hurt, just enough to anchor. Laura inhaled sharply, then relaxed, resting a tentative hand against the dog's broad head. Duke accepted the contact, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow. Frank looked away first. That night, the storm shifted again, wind howling through the trees with renewed aggression. The generator faltered once, then steadied. Frank took first watch, sitting near the door, listening to the world strain against the cabin's defenses. He thought of the men he had lost, the calls he no longer answered, the city that had chewed him up and spit him out into this quiet exile. He had built this life to be impermeable. Now it had a crack, shaped like a woman with careful words and a dog who had made his own choice. Near dawn, headlights flashed briefly through the trees, distant, fleeting, gone almost as soon as they appeared. Frank was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, heart hammering with an old, unwelcome rhythm. Duke was already alert, silent, waiting for command. The lights did not return. When morning came, Laura looked worse, pale again, exhaustion hollowing her eyes. She said nothing about the lights, but Frank knew she had seen them. Her silence confirmed what his instincts already told him. Someone was searching, not rescuing, hunting. Outside, the snow lay pristine once more, hiding tracks, hiding intentions. Frank stood on the porch, breath fogging the air, and felt the weight of choice settle heavy in his chest. He had survived by avoiding involvement, by staying small, by keeping his world contained. That strategy had expired. Inside, Laura watched him through the frost-rimmed window, Duke at her side, and for the first time since she had been found, she allowed herself to feel afraid, not of the storm, but of what would happen when it finally passed. The storm loosened its grip just enough to become dangerous. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered, carrying sound farther than it should, bending distance and intent into something deceptive. Snow still covered the ground in a thick, uneven crust, but the sky had lifted, revealing a dull, pale light that made every shadow look deliberate. Frank Miller did not trust that kind of quiet. He had learned long ago that violence rarely announced itself loudly. It preferred patience. Frank stood near the back window of the cabin, partially concealed by the wall, his broad shoulders tense beneath his jacket. His breathing was steady but shallow, the kind he had trained himself into during long hours of surveillance when movement meant failure. His steel blue eyes tracked the tree line, reading the terrain the way others read faces. Age had slowed his body, but it had sharpened his judgment. He no longer rushed. He waited. Duke sensed the shift before Frank spoke. The German shepherd lay near the door, his body stretched but ready, muscles tight beneath his thick coat. His muzzle had gone gray in recent years, and his movements carried the faint stiffness of age, but his eyes were clear, alert, alive with purpose. His ears pivoted slowly, tracking sounds too faint for human hearing. Duke was not looking for a fight. He was calculating distance. Laura sat on the couch, bundled in blankets, her injured leg elevated, watching both men, one human, one canine, move into a version of themselves shaped by past lives they rarely discussed. She looked different now than when Frank had found her in the cabin, cleaner, stronger, but also more exposed. Her hair was pulled back neatly, revealing the sharp intelligence in her face, and her green eyes no longer darted aimlessly. They watched, absorbed, measured. She understood what was happening. She had lived long enough in dangerous spaces to recognize preparation. "They won't come straight in," she said quietly. "They don't like witnesses." Frank nodded once. "They won't come at all if they think it's not worth it." He moved deliberately through the cabin, adjusting the oil lamps, dimming some, extinguishing others, controlling how light leaked through the windows. He cleared small items from the floor, removed anything that could shift or fall. Each action was calm, efficient, stripped of drama. This was not bravado. This was memory. Years earlier, Frank had led men through places far tighter and darker than this cabin. Back then, he had been faster, louder, more confident in his body's ability to absorb punishment. Now, he respected his limits. He chose angles over force, patience over confrontation. Outside, a branch snapped. Duke rose without sound, moving to Frank's side. The dog's tail was low, still. His breathing slowed, controlled. He glanced up at Frank once, a silent question. Frank answered with a slight tilt of his head toward the back of the property. Duke shifted, padding quietly to position himself where he could see without being seen. Minutes passed. Then more. A shape moved between the trees, just a suggestion at first, then another. Two men keeping distance between them, using the terrain. They wore heavy winter coats, dark and practical, faces obscured by scarves and hats pulled low. Frank noted their posture immediately, confident but not trained, cautious but impatient. Men used to having power without earning it. One of them was tall and narrow, his movements sharp, almost twitchy, his beard uneven and poorly kept. The other was broader, heavier, with a thick neck and a deliberate slowness that suggested brute confidence rather than thought. They stopped short of the clearing, scanning the cabin. Laura's breath caught. Frank raised a hand slightly, signaling stillness. The men spoke quietly to each other, their voices distorted by distance and wind, but Frank didn't need to hear the words. He read the rhythm, the hesitation. They were deciding whether to approach, whether the risk outweighed the reward. Frank moved. He stepped outside, not toward them, but laterally, placing himself where the snow was deepest, where movement would be loud and slow. He made no effort to hide his presence. Instead, he allowed them to see him, an older man, broad-shouldered, unarmed in appearance, standing his ground without challenge. Duke remained unseen, silent. "Road's closed," Frank called out, his voice carrying easily through the cold air. "You're a long way from anywhere." The men froze. The taller one lifted his chin, squinting. "We're looking for someone," he replied. His voice was younger than Frank expected, edged with irritation. "Woman. Injured. You see anyone pass through?" Frank didn't answer immediately. Silence was a tool. He let it stretch, let the men fill it with their own assumptions. "Plenty of storms take people," Frank said finally. "Mountains don't care who you're looking for." The heavier man shifted his weight, boots crunching. "We can check the place," he said, already taking a step forward. That was when Duke stepped into view. The German shepherd emerged from the shadow of the trees, positioning himself just off Frank's flank, far enough to be visible, close enough to matter. His stance was calm, deliberate, his gaze fixed on the men without aggression. He did not bark, he did not growl. He waited. The effect was immediate. The taller man stiffened. The heavier one stopped cold, eyes flicking to the dog, then back to Frank. "That your dog?" the taller man asked. "He is," Frank replied. Duke took one step forward, just enough to redraw the boundary. Snow crunched softly under his weight. His ears remained forward, his tail still. This was not a threat. It was a statement. The wind shifted again, carrying the sound of distant radio chatter from somewhere down the mountain. Search crews, perhaps, or county patrols reopening routes. As conditions improved, Frank hadn't called anyone. He hadn't needed to. Timing, he knew, was often more effective than force. The men exchanged a glance. The heavier one exhaled sharply, irritation bleeding through his composure. "Not worth it," he muttered. They backed away slowly, careful not to turn their backs. Frank didn't move until they disappeared into the trees, swallowed by distance and snow. Only then did he feel it, the deep bone-level fatigue settling into his limbs, the ache in his knees, the dull throb behind his eyes. He turned back toward the cabin, shoulders sagging slightly now that the moment had passed. Inside, Laura had watched everything. Her hands trembled faintly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You didn't threaten them." "No," Frank said. "Didn't need to." Duke returned to his place by the door, lowering himself carefully onto the floor. His breathing slowed, the tension draining from his frame. He was old, Frank realized, older than he wanted to admit. But he was still good. Frank sank into the chair across from Laura, exhaustion finally visible in the set of his jaw. "They won't be back," he said. "Not today." Laura nodded, swallowing. "You could have turned me away." Frank looked at his hands, scarred and shaking just slightly now. "I've turned away enough people in my life." Outside, the storm continued its retreat, leaving behind a fragile, uneasy calm. Frank stared into the fire, feeling something unfamiliar stir beneath the fatigue. Not pride, not anger, recognition. He was not finished yet. Spring did not arrive all at once in the high country. It came in small concessions, snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes, water ticking steadily from the eaves, the air losing its bite and taking on the clean mineral smell of thawed earth. Frank Miller noticed these changes the way he noticed everything now, quietly, without celebration, with a cautious respect for transitions that could still turn dangerous if misunderstood. The road opened first. A county plow came through one gray morning, its blade scraping loudly against packed ice, leaving behind a narrow ribbon of gravel and wet slush that connected Frank's cabin to the rest of the world again. He watched it from the porch, Duke standing beside him, the dog's tail swaying slowly, not with excitement but with recognition. Movement meant change. Change meant attention. Laura Bennett left the cabin 2 days later. She did not leave in a rush. There was no dramatic farewell, no apologies heavy with expectation. She packed quietly, folding borrowed clothes with care, placing them neatly on the table where Frank would find them. When she stood, her injured leg still protested, but she bore weight evenly now, her posture straighter, her movements steadier. The woman who had been found shivering in a dark cabin weeks earlier had hardened into someone else, leaner, sharper, stripped down to essentials. Laura's appearance had shifted in subtle ways. Her chestnut hair, once loose and tangled, was now cut shorter, practical, brushing her jawline. Her skin, pale during the storm, had taken on a healthier tone, though faint shadows remained beneath her eyes, evidence of nights spent awake with consequences rather than fear. She wore simple jeans and boots Sarah had brought up from town, clothing chosen for function rather than impression. She looked like someone trying to disappear into an honest life rather than escape one. "I won't go far," Laura said as she stood by the door, one hand resting briefly on the frame. "There's a small place in town, nothing fancy." Frank nodded. He did not ask which town, how long she planned to stay, or what name she would use. He had learned that trust did not require interrogation. "You'll be safer," he said. She met his eyes. Not safer, just clearer. Duke approached her then, moving with the careful dignity of age, his nails clicking softly on the floor. He pressed his head briefly against her thigh, a quiet acknowledgement rather than affection. Laura knelt with a soft exhale, resting her forehead against his for a moment. Duke accepted it, then stepped back, decision complete. When she drove away, Frank did not watch until the truck disappeared. He turned back inside before the dust settled. Life adjusted itself around the absence she left behind. Frank returned to routines that had once been rigid, but now felt flexible, as if the cabin itself had learned something about occupancy. He repaired a loose stair, replaced a warped shelf, and stacked the remaining firewood with less urgency. Duke slept more, his muzzle grayer by the week, his breathing slower, deeper. The shepherd's age was undeniable now. His joints stiffened in the mornings, and Frank found himself timing walks to warmer parts of the day. A week after Laura left, Sarah Whitman drove up the mountain. She stepped out of her pickup with the same quiet competence she carried everywhere. Sarah was tall and wiry, her body shaped by years of lifting, climbing, and working outdoors rather than any gym routine. Her hair, light brown threaded heavily with gray, was pulled into a low braid beneath a faded baseball cap. Sun and wind had weathered her skin into a warm, durable tan, and fine lines framed her eyes, which missed little and judged less. She wore a denim jacket over a flannel shirt, boots caked in drying mud, and carried a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. "You alive up here?" she called, her voice dry, almost amused. Frank stepped onto the porch. "Depends who's asking." Sarah smiled, the expression brief but genuine. She glanced down at Duke, who wagged his tail once in recognition. "You look older," she told Frank. "So do you," he replied. She handed him the bag. Inside were groceries, mail, and a folded envelope. Frank set it aside without opening it. "I heard about the road," Sarah said, "and about your guest." Frank didn't deny it. "She's gone." Sarah studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Or bad. Hard to tell." "She chose," Frank said. Sarah accepted that. She always had. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to water drip from the roof. Finally, she spoke again. Town's changing," she said. "People coming back, others leaving. Laura took a room over the hardware store. Quiet woman, keeps to herself." Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You talked to her?" "I talked to everyone," Sarah said mildly. "She's trying." That was enough. As spring edged forward, Frank found himself doing something he hadn't planned. He left the mountain more often. Not far. Just to town, just to stand in line at the feed store, just to exchange nods and brief words with people who did not demand explanations. He was still a reserved man, still slow to speak, but the door he had once barricaded inside himself now stood ajar. One afternoon, he saw Laura again. She was outside the hardware store, sleeves rolled up, unloading boxes from the back of a truck. She had lost weight, her movements efficient, purposeful. When she saw Frank, she froze briefly, then straightened, her expression calm. "Frank," she said, no tension, no expectation. "Laura." They stood like that for a moment, two people acknowledging shared history without reopening it. Duke remained at Frank's side, his tail wagging once, then settling. "I'm working here," Laura said, gesturing to the boxes. "Temporary." Frank nodded. "Good." That was all. As weeks passed, winter retreated fully, leaving behind mud, exposed stone, and the first signs of green pushing stubbornly through the ground. Frank felt the shift inside himself as well. The nights were still quiet, but no longer heavy. He slept longer. When he woke, the past did not reach for him immediately. Duke's age became the quiet center of Frank's days. The dog moved slower now, rested more, but his presence was constant. One evening, as Frank sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the ridge, Duke settled at his feet with a long sigh, his head resting against Frank's boot. Frank reached down without thinking, his hand finding familiar fur. "You did good," he murmured. Duke's tail thumped once. Frank understood something then, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with the steady clarity of a man who had lived long enough to accept truths without demanding explanations. None of them had been rescued. Not Laura, not Duke, not himself. They had simply reached a point where continuing became possible. Winter had not broken them. It had refined them. In the quiet moments of life, miracles rarely arrive with thunder. They come through endurance, mercy, and the unseen hands that guide us when we have nothing left to give. Sometimes, God does not remove the storm. He gives us the strength, the companion, or the second chance needed to walk through it. In our everyday lives, when burdens feel heavy and hope feels distant, remember that purpose often returns through small acts of courage, honesty, and grace. If this story spoke to your heart, share it with someone who may need reassurance today. Leave a comment about what this journey meant to you, and subscribe to the channel to continue walking with us through stories of faith, resilience, and quiet miracles. If you believe that God still works quietly through kindness, loyalty, and the courage to choose truth over fear, and that every good deed is seen even when no one else is watching, type Amen in the comments below. Your faith, your compassion, and your voice matter more than you know. God bless you. Thank you for watching.